Welcome to Psychologist Talks. This is gonna be another kind of philosophical one. I've been thinking a lot about like what the purpose of history is, and particularly through the lens of like history in regard to our propensity for self-destruction. So you'll see I have numerous episodes talking about self-destruction. One of them, in the lurches of society is one of the titles. I'll link it below if you're on my YouTube channel. Is this notion of like inevitably at some point we have to go through a self-destruction phase, that there has to be sort of a forest fire, a proverbial forest fire for the forest to grow back more healthy, healthier, more healthy, I don't know. And so I find this to be interesting of like, well, so if any of you were taught the way that I was taught about history growing up, it's like, well, we learn from our past mistakes so we don't repeat them again. It kind of comes at odds with this notion of at some point, inevitably, humankind will engage in self-destruction. There seems to be no other path. And that happens every, 40 to 50 years. If you're talking about like significant destruction, maybe you're talking one every 100 or several hundred years. We go through these really important lurches that cannot be avoided or averted. So then what is the purpose of history if it's not to prevent the past from happening again? It's like, well, maybe there's a little bit of a middle ground here. First and foremost, history is not about prevention. History is about the acquisition and passing down of knowledge, not just of mistakes, but just themes and hows and whys, and just seeing, how human beings have made decisions and the implications and results or consequences of those decisions. And that can include the ones that tend to go quite positively on top of the ones that don't tend to go quite as positively. And importantly, that's iterative work, right? One experience, one incident does not make a trend, particularly because these incidences, these experiences happen in the context of a history that no longer exists. And so you have to sort of realize that even if history teaches us one particular thing, it is somewhat decontextualized from the present day. Now, us human beings don't change as much as I think people like to think of like, oh, here we are at 2025 and magically we are so substantially different than, in 1825. It's like, well, yes, there's a lot of different contexts for sure, but also don't mishear me and overcorrect in the other direction. We should not ignore our past simply because it was 100 years ago. Us human beings and how we operate, our emotions and how we relate to each other is more similar than you think. Power structures change, methods of communication change, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, there are some definitely some common truths or some common trends. So there's this iterative learning, and we have to kind of contextualize and recontextualize the lessons that history teach us. But at the end of the day, I wonder if history helps mitigate the frequency at which we make mistakes. Because when we're informed by the past, we are more inclined to see the issues in the present and thereby avert potential disasters, again, more efficiently or sooner. I think of it in your own personal life. What the hell does wisdom mean? Well, often what's happening is not just, we're perfect human beings. We become perfect human beings because we avert all disasters. It's just simply we've experienced and seen it enough times that we finally get, if ideally, not everybody, let me be clear. And some people kind of go off the deep end and get super, angsty and resentful and nihilistic about the world as they get older. But in an ideal world, we've kind of seen it enough times. We're finally like, I see it now, right? I don't have to go so far down the beaten path for me to realize the lesson I can learn. And when, we try to bequeath that knowledge to the younger generation, it's not a carbon copy. They also have to go through this iterative, quote unquote, mistake making to eventually acquire or be able to really assimilate and work with that wisdom that you're trying to pass down. And all you're doing is hopefully shortening or I was going to say shorten the duration it takes to get there, or a different way of saying it helps the younger generation be quicker to realize it. So if you've ever had a really, like a mentor or a parent or, a family member or even a friend that often offers wisdom. That is the benefit. They're not magically preventing all tragedy in your life. They just insert things in your brain that lets you see things a little bit clearer in a way that you don't always anticipate until suddenly you're in conflict and you're like, oh shoot, is that thing? Now, the problem here is that's an N of one, right? It's just you, and you don't have thousands and millions of people around you that you're dealing with. It's more insulated. The challenge with society is you've got millions of people at this juncture. You got global. Think about like global society too. Oh, you got a hell of a lot of people. I can't remember. What are we at now? Like, what's the world's population? Let's Google this real quick since I don't prepare for these. World's population. What number are we at? Billions? Yeah, 8 billion. In 2023, 8 billion people, right? And obviously, different histories across different nations, but there's a collective history that has been growing for quite some time. And invariably, whatever wisdoms we can derive from history get lost in the sort of chorus of voices and experiences amongst the millions and billions. And so, while history, if we are versed in it, and we, heaven forbid, actually try to be versed in it and understand why, rather than rewriting history or ignoring history, is that we can mitigate the frequency or volume of disasters, but we will never, ever prevent self-destruction. What ends up inevitably happening, particularly when we get to periods of self-destruction. This is just totally me making this up. I don't know if it has any grounds, but eventually the masses stop being informed by history and the cycles and themes that are arising that should be a warning call. But the masses lose sight, and then there's a subset of people, though, that continue to champion the history. They might not see themselves as championing history, but in essence, they are the stewards of the seeds that history gives us that we can plant ahead of the inevitable fire. And so, if say in the present day we're in a period of self-destruction, what those of us who see, not foresee all things, but we see that there is something going towards a path of self-destruction, and we scream from the rooftops all day long, hoping someone will listen, hoping someone will notice. The worst case scenario is that we are at least planting seeds. We do not know if the seeds will grow. We don't have that power, and they are just individual seeds. They might not be planted deep enough. Maybe we don't have power to force them to be planted, but we try the best we can because that is the greater purpose of humankind, is to affect some sort of change. And so we speak our minds, we say what we can alert what we can, and we plant the seeds for when the fire actually finally occurs, there can be growth afterwards. That all these other folks that are losing touch, they're losing kind of sight of the greater narrative, they stop planting seeds. Somebody has to keep planting those seeds to ensure that a forest can regrow once the fire goes. Now, all of this, not to get a little bit cynical or perhaps overly pessimistic, is like that assumes that humans are destined to survive forever. Maybe we're not. Maybe we're not. I'm inclined to believe between like space exploration and just how like there's mass extinction events are incredibly rare, and it won't just be us dying if it's a mass extinction event. But I should just name that as like this assumes that we will be alive to see the day. But I think it's within reason, and I guess as a final point. One of the challenges I think of being a seed planter is sometimes nobody recognizes that you're planting seeds, and sometimes it takes so long for the seeds to eventually be ready to germinate that you might not get to see the fruits of that labor. That if you were born on the heels of a growing turmoil and eventual destruction, you might be getting to a certain age. I wonder if I'm kind of going down this path of like, I'm planting as many seeds as I can before the inevitable forest fire, but I might not live to see the forest ever regrow. And that's kind of a weird and somewhat depressing notion. I mean, it's not depressing if you have that sort of faith or belief that the seeds are being planted and that they can regrow. But when you think about, being born into a time of greater prosperity and less conflict and less self-destruction versus being born into a time when your primary role is to watch and fret and be frustrated and anxious and just do the best you can in the greater hope that something will come of it later, that's a tough place to be in. And I think you see bigger issues with depression and anxiety and suicide around these times because people start to feel powerless in their own lives, we begin to lose touch with a greater meaning and a greater purpose. And perhaps that is all I'm speaking to, is that, we can, if you believe that there is no greater ability to affect change and you're born in a time of turmoil, you're going to put yourself into a pretty deep hole. And this is coming from a very depressive person. so please note that. I'm not trying to be all super positive optimistic here, but it's what I have chosen to believe is like, well, it's actually, it causes me more angst if I believe my job is to prevent tragedy. I mean, I can try, right? I can try to bequeath knowledge. I can try to offer what I can to inform people and to encourage health. But at the end of the day, the worst case scenario is I'm planting important seeds, even if I don't get to see those seeds ever germinate in my lifetime, for whatever that's worth. So that's my little ad lib, thoughts on history. What's the purpose of history and what is our role in history? As always, I thank you for listening and watching, and stay curious.